topic for today is music in the Ozarks, and it's a very important topic. You could spend half the semester talking about music in the Ozarks, but before we get to music in the Ozarks, I will tell you that's not a hint for our famous person of today. This is not a musician. Yeah, it's not a topical famous person of the Ozarks today. Well, it's sort of looks like somebody's grandma, doesn't it? Yeah. No, it's not Rose O'Neal. No, it's not Rose O'Neal, the Cupid doll inventor. Very different, sort of. What sense do you get looking at this woman? What do you think she would do or be about? Looks kind of matronly.
Yeah, wasn't a Hollywood star, I don't think.
Looks kind of like a teacher. Okay, nobody, I thought maybe somebody would know this one. Not a teacher. Grandmama? Let's try Maul Barker. Has anybody ever heard of Maul Barker?
Yes.
Yeah. Remind me, Jeff, to stay away from your grandma. Yeah, and your mother. Yeah, if she's anything like Maul Barker, that's, yeah. You've heard of Maul Barker probably, the Barker Gang, or sometimes called the Carpus Barker Gang. Maul Barker was notorious back in the 30s when she met her demise. She was actually born Arizona Clark in Ash Grove, which is not too far west of Springfield, and grew up in this area. And eventually the Barker family moved to Oklahoma and spent many years in Oklahoma. And her sons got involved in crime. And one of them, while he was in the Kansas State Penitentiary, made friends with a guy by the name of Carpus. And when they got out, they formed a gang. And the Barker Gang was one of the most notorious criminal gangs of the 1930s, the early part of the 1930s. They were bank robbers, they were kidnappers, they murdered people, all kinds of crimes. And in those days, Maul Barker was lumped in with them, and the popular image of Maul Barker was that she was this woman gangster who basically ran the gang. But we know now that that was a misrepresentation of Maul Barker. She was an accomplice in that she sort of aided and abetted by taking care of the gang members, her sons, and trying to keep them out of trouble. But there's no evidence that she ever planned any of the heists or kidnappings. And more than likely, she was just sort of along for the ride. As they moved across the country and evaded law enforcement, and she was just kind of there being motherly in some ways. It just so happens that her kids were ruthless gangsters, and she ends up, along with one of her sons, getting gunned down in a house in Florida by the FBI. And there's even been speculation that J. Edgar Hoover had the FBI, the director of the FBI, had the FBI kind of doctor the paperwork to suggest that she was more important to the gang's activity than she actually was. It wouldn't be a great public relations thing to be gunning down a grandmother in a house somewhere. So you could see maybe they might have tried to make it look like she was more integral to the gang's activities than she was. But that's the famous Maul Barker.
Was she your grandmother?
I don't know. I don't know that any of her kids had children or not. They were all, a couple of them died young, but she had several kids. I don't know.
Where in Florida was she?
I don't remember the name of the town. Yeah. But they had the Barker gang was considered to have been involved in a murder in Pocahontas, Arkansas, in West Plains. The sheriff of West Plains was gunned down, and it was suspected that one of the Barker gang did that. And then they eventually left, went to Minnesota, and sort of traveled around the country. Didn't spend a lot of time in the Ozarks when they were the actual Barker gang. All right, and our word for today, gum. Everybody knows what gum is, right? In the Ozarks, gum can mean something besides what you chew. Does anybody know what a gum can be in the Ozarks?
That tree sap?
A tree?
Tree sap?
Tree sap? No, you're getting pretty close though. Yeah. Well, I guess you could chew tree sap, waxy tree sap if you wanted to, but that's not what this is referring to. This is actually a noun though. All right, nobody's going to get this one, huh? Not even Butch today. Okay, a gum can be a trap, or it can be a beehive, a bee gum. Anybody refer to a bee gum? Up until the last generation or so, when someone in the Ozarks was talking about a beehive, generally they would refer to it as a bee gum, and it could be pretty much any hive, whether it was in a tree or in a more domesticated box. When I was a boy, my grandpa had a bee gum that sat down not too far from my grandparents' backyard. He had bees, and that's what we called it, the bee gum. And my grandpa also made rabbit traps that we called gums, rabbit gums. That's what he always called them, rabbit gums.
I caught a mole in my gum today.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Now you
Dead.
for whatever gets stuck in it, it doesn't matter if you call it a trap or a gum or a death shed or whatever you want to call it there. That's it's the end of it. But yeah, both of those terms they're still in somewhat common use out in the rural Ozarks. Not the rural Ozarks that you guys have been visiting, obviously, but maybe more south of the border, down in the Arkansas Ozarks. All right.
What's polecat?
All right.
Did you find that in here before, polecat?
Yeah, who knows what a polecat is? It's a skunk. Yeah, I don't think we have had polecat in here, but yeah, it's a polecat is a skunk. Yeah. All right. So we got bee gums, rabbit gums. I guess you can make different kinds of gum. Anything. Cockroach gums. I don't know. Never heard anybody call it that, but. And usually when you talk about a trap that's referred to as a gum, it's usually a homemade enclosed contraption with a trap door on it. That's usually what a gum is, something that they spring and the door comes down on it. That's what all of the gums that we had were. Okay, a little music in the Ozarks. We're going to listen to a snippet or two of some tunes today and talk about different kinds of music in the Ozarks, what people think of when we say Ozark music. And certainly one of the things that the Ozarks today is most known for is music. And when someone says Ozarks music, what comes to mind? Fiddles? Banjo? Bluegrassy sort of stuff. You still find those family groups where everybody just sort of miraculously plays something. and they all play together. But yeah, this is, for most people, even if you're not all that familiar with the Ozarks, when someone said Ozarks music, you don't think of punk rock or rap or necessarily even country music in general. You have a certain image that comes to mind, and it's usually that sort of old-timey music, whether it's bluegrass, which is actually somewhat new compared to a lot of traditional Ozarks music, or if it's string band music led by a fiddle or banjo music, traditional mountain music, sort of pre-bluegrass mountain music. We kind of know what we're talking about. And if you have, like we do every fall, we have the Ozark cultural celebration or whatever that's called here on campus every fall. They bring in musical acts, and they usually fit into one of these categories. They're usually bluegrass, or they're fiddlers, or they're traditional southern mountain music, string bands, and things like that. It's just kind of what you expect when you say Ozarks music. Now we know that the Ozarks is a big place, and it's an increasingly diverse place, and you find all different kinds of musical acts coming out of the Ozarks today. And as we'll see later on, some of the more famous of the last generation or two haven't necessarily been bluegrass acts or traditional string band sorts of acts, but they often have a little bit of element of that in their music, even if they're playing rock music. But we'll eventually get to that. And all of these, in some way or another, are sort of old-timey. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the vast majority of the people in the Ozarks don't really listen to this music, right? If you go to, especially if you're talking about people under 50, they're not really listening to what's considered Ozark music. That's just the music that we present to the rest of the world as representing us. The same thing happens in Appalachia, where you have Appalachian mountain music, and most people who live there aren't listening to it. Cajuns with their Zydeco or whatever it is they're playing down there, most of them are listening to the same top 40 pop music and country music that the rest of the country listens to. So some of this is just out of tradition. That's one of the things that we've become known for, is our old-timey music. And many people in the Ozarks continue that tradition, continue to play that music, although most people have been integrated into the rest of the country and tend to listen to the same sorts of stuff, probably more country than anything else. But it's still an important thing to keep in mind that when people think of the Ozarks and think of music, that's what they generally think of. And that's mainly what we're going to talk about today, that sort of traditional Ozarks music. Just like when we talked about traditional architecture and house building in the Ozarks, most people don't live in log cabins anymore. But in the 19th century, that was what people lived in, and that's what we talked about, those old traditions. And we'll do the same thing today with music. Obviously, you can say this about pretty much any sort of music, and we'll talk about the two very broad categories of Ozarks music, instrumental and vocal, and sometimes both. We'll have examples of instrumental-only music, vocal-only music, the tradition of ballad singing or ballad singing, as it was sometimes pronounced in the Ozarks, goes way back beyond any notion of an Ozarks, certainly. And we have recordings of lots of ballad singers unaccompanied by any sort of instrumental music. We'll listen to a couple of those. And for many years, fiddle music, as Butch pointed out, was the music, the instrumental music, and the instrument most associated with the Ozarks, and really with much of rural America in general, not just the Ozarks. And why would the fiddle be the instrument of choice, especially if we go back to the 19th century, say? Why would the fiddle be the instrument of choice for a place like the Ozarks? Well, some people made them, and some people still hand make fiddles. That's maybe the most important thing, is it's loud. And if you're talking about the days before amplification, what were fiddles often used for? To play at dances. And especially if you're on a wood floor somewhere and you got a lot of shoes and feet clomping around on a wood floor, it gets really noisy, people hollering and stuff like that. And you want an instrument that you can hear over the ruckus. You can hear, and the fiddle certainly fit that. And sometimes it was more important to play it loud than it was to play it all that accurately. You know, just getting some sort of rhythm and hit a note every once in a while, and we'll just dance through it. So that was important, loudness. What else would be important about the fiddle in say, the 19th century? As opposed to, say, the piano. It's portable. You can get it from one place to another, and that's why the fiddler was the most important guy in any community when it came to celebration time, to dance time. The fiddler it wasn't the piano player. There weren't many pianos in the Ozarks really until the 20th century. But a fiddle, you just hop on the horse or take off walking, take it with you. What was the old saying, the difference between how to tell the difference between a violin and a fiddle? Well, but the old country saying was, a violin comes in a wooden case, a fiddle comes in a pillowcase. Yeah. So, I mean, that was sort of, reflecting that kind of, laid back, sort of less formal nature of the fiddle as opposed to the violin. And so the fiddle player really could just go anywhere with the fiddle. Take your fiddle and bow and just show up. And fiddle players were in demand for all kinds of things, especially dances in those days. The woman picture there, Violet Hensley, is, I believe, Miss Hensley is still living. She's well into her 90s now and has become kind of a regional treasure and makes the fiddles that she uses, or made them up until the last few years. And for several years performed down at Silver Dollar City. And she's actually from North Arkansas, but quite a well-known person. Now, for group performances in the Ozarks, the kind of string band was the most common, usually led by a fiddle with guitar and occasionally a banjo, but certainly all you really need is a fiddle and a guitar, kind of a rhythm guitar and a fiddle going. But if you really wanted to make a band out of it, in those early days, late 1800s, early 1900s, throw in a banjo, maybe a mandolin, but probably not much else besides that. And even a mandolin wouldn't have been terribly common in those bands. But as time wore on, banjos would have become more popular as parts of string bands. And some of the instruments that we now often associate with Ozarks music, like dulcimers and auto harps, were very, very uncommon until the folk revival of the 1950s and 60s came along, and people kind of rediscovered these instruments, and they became more popular among folkies than they actually were among natives of the Ozarks. But several stringed instruments. As I mentioned, pianos remained rare in the Ozarks, even for churches, especially in the rural Ozarks into the 20th century. It was in the late 1800s, in that Victorian era, it was considered a status symbol to have a piano or an organ in your house. And if you did that and you lived in the rural Ozarks, you were probably among the better off people in your community. More town people would have a piano or an organ in their house in those days, and often teach their daughters to play them, and occasionally sons, but it was very common for young women to learn to play pianos or organs if you were from a middle-class family. That's right, especially in the days before the railroad came in. And yeah, it was, without just, if you think about taking a piano in a wagon over a rough road, no telling what sound it would make by the time you got it home, if it would even sound like a piano, and then you'd have to have a professional tuner to come around and tune it. And, yeah, that's a big reason why they weren't all that common. And I've never really read much about Ozark piano makers. I find a lot of references to fiddle makers and even people who make guitars and banjos and stuff, but not a lot of piano makers am I familiar with. There probably was one in Springfield, a big town, but now here's an example of a homemade guitar that looks kind of like a hybrid between a mandolin and a guitar. But that is Jimmy Driftwood's. Anybody ever heard of Jimmy Driftwood? Nobody? You ever heard of a song called The Battle of New Orleans? Okay, some of you, even if you don't, if it doesn't, the title doesn't ring a bell, you probably heard the song. It was one of the most popular songs of the late 1950s. It went to number one on the pop and country charts both, I believe. But he wrote that. He didn't sing the popular version of it, but he was the author of that song and wrote several other songs that became popular during the early days of the folk revival in the late 50s. And Driftwood was a performer. He was a school teacher and school principal who in middle age got a recording contract, went to Nashville, made a few records, and ended up spending the rest of his career touring around playing music. And it was all because of the folk revival of the 50s and 60s, and he played this kind of old-timey, he was an expert at writing songs that sounded like old folk songs, even though he had written them, and sometimes he used old folk melodies to write his songs with. And he had instruments that he had made up these elaborate backstories for. His grandpa had made it from a bedstead and a fence post and all this kind of stuff. He made up most of the backstories, but he was an entertainer, so nobody really held him to a high standard of truth. He's telling these stories while he's on stage. But Driftwood was from Arkansas, and became quite a well-known character in the late 50s and early 60s. Played at the Grand Ole Opry and
Is that his real name?
No, his real name was James Morris. It sounded like a fake name, didn't it? Yeah. Yeah, James Morris became Jimmy Driftwood, and he was, he became, in the 50s and 60s, probably the best known Ozarks performer of traditional music. He sang a lot of traditional old-timey songs, not just the ones that he wrote, but a lot of actual old-timey songs as he toured around, and became pretty well known and became very much associated with the Ozarks, and had this kind of persona of an Ozarks backwoodsman, even though he was a college graduate, had that kind of thing going on. So here he is with a mouth bow. Not a lot of variety do you get out of a mouth bow. Yeah, but that was probably a rare instrument that you would have found in the Ozarks, but it was another example of something that was kind of rediscovered in the folk revival, and people were interested in it. Kind of like the tub bass or something, that sort of thing. But that's another picture of Driftwood. A lot of these pictures that I've got up here were taken by a professional photographer. That's why I've got them up there. They're really nice pictures. And they were taken in the early 1960s, around the time, and we'll talk about this in more detail later when the Arkansas Folk Festival starts. And most of these pictures that I've got here were taken in Mountain View, Arkansas, where the Ozark Folk Center is today. And they were just various musicians who were affiliated with the early days of the Arkansas Folk Festival, like this guy who's really excited to have his picture taken. Yeah. And the guy in the background here, you can see he's holding a guitar. His name is Glenn Orland, and Glenn is still living. He still lives down just outside of Mountain View, and Glenn is well known within cowboy music and cowboy poetry circles. Glenn was quite an interesting story. He was born in Minnesota, grew up in California, was kind of a cowboy in California, somehow ended up in the Arkansas Ozarks, and became one of the main musicians in the early days of the folk revival down there in the Mountain View area. Here's a guy playing what many old-time Ozarkers refer to as a French harp. Most of us call it a harmonica, but it was often called a French harp or sometimes a mouth harp. But French harp was something you frequently heard. That was another really portable sort of instrument. Stick it in your pocket and take off. Here's a guy obviously playing a banjo. The banjo was an instrument with African roots, but it became, by the early 20th century, it had become very closely associated with white mountain music, even though if you go back to the Civil War era and before, the banjo was associated with black minstrel musicians, many of them black, some of them white who performed in blackface, but it sort of morphed over time into an instrument that now we consider kind of a hillbilly instrument. You know, you don't see a lot of black banjo players anymore, though there are some. It's become more closely associated with white mountain music. Here's speaking of a tub bass, that's what that is. Wash tub turned upside down and sort of like an upright bass, only it's generally just got one string, and you just can. That's what this guy's playing right here. It was often referred to as a steel guitar. It's basically a steel guitar, you know, that it's not the slide steel guitar, but this is a Hawaiian steel guitar. If you've ever heard of a Hawaiian steel guitar, that's basically what this is, a dobro. So occasionally you hear the dobro as a lead instrument, but a lot of times it's more of an accompanying instrument. But there are some well-known dobro players who, you know, are the leaders. Here's a guy playing the upright bass, and this is one reason I put him up there. This is Lee Mace, the guy playing the bass, kind of riding the bass like a witch on a broom. Mace was one of the more prominent figures in Ozarks music in the latter part of the 20th century. Mace was a square dancer and a musician who in 1953 founded his own musical theater up on the Lake of the Ozarks. He and his wife. And for more than 30 years, Mace played in his Lee Mace's Ozark Opry, as it was called. The Ozark Opry actually just closed down a few years ago. It closed down in 2005, but he died 20 years earlier than that in a plane crash. But Lee Mace was this was really before before any of the Branson music shows came along, and Mace found an audience in all the tourists who flocked to the Lake of the Ozarks from spring to fall, and especially in the summer season, and ran his Ozarks Opry for years and years, catering to that tourist clientele there at the Lake of the Ozarks, and playing mostly a combination of traditional Ozarks music with a little bluegrass and a little country, just standard country music. So it was very much like the older Branson shows down there, just kind of appealing to what a broad range of the public wanted to hear. And so he was a very important character, and he was from that area as well. All right. Now that we've had picture time, let's talk a little bit about ballads and other songs that were popular in the Ozarks in the 19th century and into the 20th century, and that are still performed in sort of folk revival kind of ways. Very few people in the Ozarks today still hand down songs in the way they once did, in the traditional manner of learning them from grandparents or uncles and aunts and things like that. It still happens, but it's much less common today, as most kids listen to the same radio and albums, or what do you call them now? Do you still call them albums? Do we still have albums, don't we?
That's what they call them,
but they're not they're not really, they're not what you think of as vinyl albums. But we sort of, most of our kids nowadays and young people listen to the same stuff that everybody else does around the country. But there are still a few instances where you have these traditional songs handed down in the traditional manner, learning them from an elder, something like that. And that's how most of these songs were learned well into the middle of the 20th century in the Ozarks. The more rural and the more isolated the areas were, the longer this traditional folk song system held on, the more likely it was that you were going to learn these songs from grandma or something like that. And there were different kinds of songs that people learned, and we'll mention just a few of them. The child ballads, broadsides, minstrel songs, local songs, tin pan alley ditties. We'll hear an example of some of these and talk about how these are different. And all of these together made up the folk song collections that became very popular in the mid-20th century and remained popular until recent years, where folk song collectors, as we'll talk about in a minute, would go out and find people who knew lots of these old songs. Many of them had been passed down literally for generation after generation after generation, going all the way back to the British Isles. And so some of these were really old. Some of them were new, like the local songs. People were continuing to contribute to the folk song catalog. And when we talk about folk songs, not all of these songs that we'll listen to are actually folk songs. Generally, a folk song is a song that just kind of rises out of the anonymous folk somewhere. We don't necessarily know where it was first written, who wrote it, anything like that. It just kind of shows up at some point. Most of these songs, or a lot of them, can be traced back to an original publication somewhere, or a broadside, and we'll talk about what a broadside is, or to someone who we know actually wrote the songs, if it was a minstrel song or something like that. So we'll look at some of these different kinds of songs. Now this is Almeda Riddle, and we'll hear at least one song performed by Almeda Riddle, maybe a couple of them as we go through here. Almeda Riddle was a woman who was discovered, as we always say about the folk artists, they're always discovered, someone finds them somewhere. But she was in her mid-50s. She was a grandmother when she was discovered by a folk song collector in the 1950s, and went on to become probably the best known traditional folk singer especially the best known, what were often referred to as granny singers from the Ozarks. She would sing at folk festivals in the 1960s and 70s from coast to coast. She sang at Harvard, at the University of California. These different, this woman who had been a farm woman and a housewife in rural Arkansas became discovered, and we'll hear her voice, a very distinctive voice, and is one that you may have even heard. Occasionally, her recordings will pop up on a film somewhere, especially if it's about Appalachia or the Ozarks or something like that. I don't think any of the Winter's Bone songs was by Almeda Riddle, but we hear some of these. The first things we'll talk about are the so-called child ballads. Does anybody know what a child ballad is? It has nothing to do with children. The child ballads are named after the British scholar who first started collecting these songs. His last name was Child in the late 1800s. Actually, he was an American scholar who started collecting British songs, old songs from Great Britain that dated back sometimes hundreds of years. And he eventually published a whole collection of these old ballads that many of which had been preserved by Americans, especially in places like Appalachia and the Ozarks. And these child ballads by Francis Childs became popular for folk music collectors in the 1900s. He published his collection in the 1800s. In the 1900s, it was very popular for folk music collectors when they first started traveling around the United States to look for these child ballads, because you knew if you found some old granny on some hillside somewhere who was singing a child ballad, that this thing had been passed down through who knows how many generations, because sometimes these songs were hundreds of years old. And these were considered kind of the gold mine songs for folk music collectors in those early days. And many of them just wanted to collect people, just find people who could sing child ballads and didn't care about anything else. Eventually, we'll get to lots of these other songs that weren't child ballads, but that's what a child ballad was, just a really, really old, usually British song of some sort about, and they were almost always sad songs about somebody getting killed or some jilted lover or something like that, or both. And a lot of them are not exactly uplifting things. Often they're very long, and we've got a couple of them here. The first one is, before we listen to a couple of these, there are a couple of really good websites. If you like old ballads or you like any of this music that we look at today, everything that we listen to is going to be on one of a couple of websites. One of them is maintained here at Missouri State. It's called the Max Hunter Collection, and it's a digitized folk song collection that's arranged by both the singer and the title of the song. And then the other one, where these come from, is the John Quincy Wolfe Collection. And we'll talk about both of these guys later on. The John Quincy Wolfe Collection is at a college, Lyon College down in Arkansas. And again, it's a digitized folk song collection where you can listen on the web, you can listen to complete versions of these songs. And in both cases, the websites will have lyrics to the song, or at least lyrics as much as we can figure out what they're saying. There will be lyrics to the song. Sometimes on the Hunter Collection, you'll even find sheet music. Not on the Wolfe Collection, but on the Hunter Collection. And the folks at the University of Arkansas are in the process of digitizing their big collection of folk music as well. So eventually you're going to have 3 of these massive collections of folk songs to listen to. All of them, almost all of them recorded in the Ozarks. But we'll hear just a bit of this song, and I've used the song titles that the singers themselves used when they recorded these. Now keep in mind, we're going to talk about folk song collectors in a minute, and I'll make it clearer what exactly folk song collectors did, what they were out there and how they worked. But all of these songs were collected by folk song collectors. All of these performers are amateurs. Some of them, it will be readily apparent that they are amateurs. But they were most of them were recorded in a living room somewhere or on a front porch with an old reel-to-reel portable tape recorder. And so these are, usually the folk song collectors would use whatever song title the singer provided them, even if it may not be the exact same title that the song is known for in the child collection. But we have a couple of child ballads, and we're not going to listen to all of these because some of them are really long, but we'll just get kind of an idea of what they sound like. This one's called The Gallows Tree, and I think it's Almeda Riddle singing this, I believe. I don't remember exactly. I'll be able to tell you when we click on this. Yeah, this is Almeda Riddle. And the way that both of these sites work is usually they will have the singer, the name of the song, and sometimes other kind of alternate names, titles for the songs, and it'll actually tell you where and when it was recorded. So that's what that date's for, August 22nd, 1957, in a place that no longer exists called Miller, Arkansas. Miller's one of several places in the Ozarks that has been drowned out by a man-made reservoir. We have lots of those. And it's underneath a lake now, or most of Miller. So you can see how long this song is. And you can see down at the bottom, this one was child number 95, usually known as the maid freed from the gallows. Does everybody know what gallows are? Yeah, somebody's going to be hanged here.
Oh, hangman, hangman, slacken up your line, for I see my father coming from a far off distant home. Oh, Father, Father, have you brought me gold? Or have you paid my fee? Or did you come to see your only son hang 'neath the gallows tree? Oh, no, son, I brought no gold, nor have I paid your fee. Alas, I have come to see a guilty son hang on a gallows tree. Oh, hangman, hangman, slacken up your line, for I see my mother coming from her far and distant home. Oh, mother, mother, have you brought me gold? Or have you paid my fee? Or have you come to see your only son hanging 'neath the gallows tree?
Has anybody ever heard that voice before? Millie, it didn't agree with you?
Well, no.
Yeah. Well, so it surprises you to find out that she's considered
Yes.
one of the classic great voices of kind of mountain. Yeah. Well, right. In a lot of ways, it is sort of the Ralph Stanley, kind of the female Ralph Stanley sort of thing.
Did she always sing a cappella?
Yeah. And since you like that, there are dozens and dozens of recordings waiting on you. Yeah, Millie, you've got the rest of your week cut out for you there. Just go home and start listening. But Almeda, I really like Almeda Riddle. Now, there's sort of a limit. You kind of hit your limit in a hurry, and especially her songs are so long, and they're drawn. She sings them a very slow. It's the timing is really, really slow on these things. But that was the style, and she's got that kind of ancient sound to her voice that people say about Ralph Stanley. He's got that sort of ancient sound. Sounds like he's from another planet almost, and certainly from another time. And her sound is very much that way. And when she's making that recording, she's probably only roughly 60 years old. She's not that old. She may not even have been 60. I can't remember when she was born, but she would have been right around 60 years old. So I'm not sure when she got that voice that just kind of sounded like, some old, woman. It's kind of hard to describe what that voice is like. But that's Almeda Riddle with one of the many child ballads that she knew, and she recorded all kinds of other songs as well on these things. And we'll listen to just a snippet of Barbara Allen, or as the singers on here, it's a husband and wife, two elderly folks, again down in the Arkansas Ozarks, who I believe they sang Barbary Ellen, which was very common in the Ozarks for old-timers to pronounce Barbara Barbary and Allen Ellen. So you get kind of a whole different name to the song, but I went ahead and left the Barbara Allen on here. And it's probably the most famous of these child ballad mountain songs. Almost everybody knew Barbara Allen, and we'll hear just a snippet of it.
In yonder town where I was born, there was a fair maid dwelling, made every youth cry well away. Her name was Barbary Ellen. 'Twas in the merry month of May, when green buds they were swelling, sweet William came from the western states and courted Barbary Allen. Was all in the month of June, when everything was blooming. Sweet William on his deathbed lay, for the love of Barbary Allen. He sent his servant to the town, where Barbary was a dwelling, saying, my master's sick and sent for you, if your name is Barbary Allen. He is sick and very sick, and death on him is dwelling, so hasten away to comfort him, O lovely Barbary Allen.
Okay, another song that's going to last for roughly half of our class period if we listen to the whole thing. And that's one of the really classic child ballads right there, Barbara Allen. Oh yeah, I'm sure I know she would have done that one. Yeah. And Joan Baez, Butch mentions, one of the great folk revival singers of the 1960s, and along with Bob Dylan and several others. But this is a good example of what you found is over the years, especially as these things made their way across North America, is the wording was often changed to fit the circumstances. So that you've got Sweet William coming from the western states instead of wherever he came from when it was still in Britain. And so a lot of times people would, especially after you've been in, these people inherited these songs after being in America for several generations, and they start looking at the lyrics or listening to the lyrics and thinking, well, that doesn't really make sense. Let's change it a little bit to fit our circumstances. And that happened. There were some people who just sang them verbatim as they learned them and never questioned any of the odd sounding lyrics, and some people took the liberty to change them and to their liking. Almeda Riddle, the last woman we heard, the Gallows woman, she was known for altering her lyrics as time went on. And in some cases, we have multiple recordings of the same song that she's made, and you can see how she's tinkered with the lyrics over time, though she often leaves the melody the same. She even tinkers with melodies sometimes. But this is another example of an old child ballad. Okay, now this is a broadside, and what this is an old song. It's actually probably an American amalgamation of several old British broadsides. And these are songs that most of the broadsides are not quite as old as the child ballads, though many of them do come from Great Britain, and some of them date back into the 1700s and early 1800s. But this is another one. And they often are kind of patterned, the same sort of thing. You know, damsels in distress and lost love and all that, and going to the gallows and all that kind of stuff. And we'll hear just a little bit of this one called A Lover's Lament, or The Silver Dagger. You can see this one was recorded in 1953. So it's been nearly 60 years since this one was recorded.
Young people all, both far and near, a lamentation you shall hear of a young man and his true love, whom he adored and praised above. He was a farmer's youngest son, and he by love was quite undone. He courted a lady. I made a mistake there. This lady. No, I guess say. Is that recorded?
Yeah, that's what I can cut out the tape and cut it out.
He courted this lady to be his bride, and a marriage contract on each side.
A little of that goes a long way. Well, not as good a singer, certainly not as good, Millie agrees, as Almeda Riddle, and I sort of like the Sutterfields too. But that's just an example of another kind of old song that you would find. You can see how long this thing is.
Why are they called broadsides?
Oh, yeah, I'm glad you asked why they're called broadsides. They're called broadsides because that's what they were printed on. You know what a broadside is in general? It's basically kind of like a poster or a single sheet of paper. When we think of a broadside today, it's something you staple up. Yeah, it's a
Broadside, yeah.
kind of like a big flyer that you would post somewhere, you know, for the circus or whatever you're advertising. Well, a broadside was generally songs that were published on one piece of paper and were often sold for like a penny or two on the streets. And so that's where the name comes from. These were published songs, but not in the way that we would think of songs being published. So,
Did these start out as poems put to music, or were they always?
yeah, as a matter of fact, the child ballads, Francis James Child, the collector of those, he didn't go out and listen to folk singers. He was more interested in finding these old ballads in published books. And that's where he did all of his research in libraries and archives and places like that, and found them in, you know, poetic forms and things like, in published written forms, instead of going out and listening to people sing these songs. So yeah, most of these began as poems, and and were set to music at some point. All right, let's go ahead and take a break, and we will continue with our Ozarks music when we come back.